This is an interesting angle. Obviously, a lot of people are talking about the geopolitics of it. This is more about the cultural aspect of it. Do you think there is a risk that we are sort of overreacting when it comes to these kind of cultural boycotts?
I think we definitely are. I mean, it seems like there's a tendency nowadays, our response to everything, particularly in the kind of cultural sphere, is either to call for censorship or to just engage in kind of vapid virtue signalling. And I think these cultural boycotts are where those two things kind of meet.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the examples you've already listed, you've had major film companies which have pulled out all of their theatrical releases from Russia. And on the flip side, you also have the treatment of Russian artists in the West and in Western countries, which is becoming increasingly unsettling. I mean, it's become slightly McCarthyite. You mentioned the case of Valery Gergiev, who was dropped by the Munich Philharmonic. He does have links to Vladimir Putin, but it was essentially issued with an ultimatum: either condemn Putin and condemn the war or lose your job. And I feel like that atmosphere has a very kind of toxic element to it, which could actually play into Putin's hands.
Why does this happen all the time? Why do people go after artists who are from particular countries or travelling to particular countries? Why is there an expectation that they should have a political input?
Well, as you suggest, I mean, this hasn't kind of come out of the clear blue. There's been kind of discussions in recent years about boycotts, cultural boycotts of Israel, other different kind of states where, again, if there's been some sort of horrendous situation, invasion or whatever. But it seems particularly potent at the moment. And I think there's just it's a product of hysteria in large part. And there's a couple of examples I think really demonstrate that. So there was a gentleman called Kirill Sokolov, who's a Russian filmmaker. He has denounced the war in Ukraine. He's got Ukrainian family. He's got family members in Kiev at the moment who are kind of, waiting for their fate. And yet he had his film dropped from the Glasgow Film Festival. There was another instance of a young man called Alexander Malefev, who is a pianist, and he was due to perform in Vancouver in Canada. Because the people who were organising the recital couldn't find any denunciation of the war in his social media accounts or whatever, they just dropped it. And again, this is just creating a genuinely quite McCarthyite atmosphere, I think. And I think it really contributes and burnishes the narrative of Russia, which is essentially trying to say they are going after all Russians because they want to destroy Russia. Anyone with a Russian name is being discriminated in the West. And it's just fueling that narrative, as well as shutting down cultural exchange and cultural discussion.
So some of those examples you've given, so people who are even sort of with, as you say, family members in Ukraine, people who haven't been vocal enough. I mean, I remember that something happened with Taylor Swift a while ago, where Taylor Swift hadn't come out and said that she didn't support Donald Trump. And therefore she became the target of a lot of online ire, shall we say. And again, it goes back to this weird expectation that these people are meant to be spokespeople. But then also, what about this thing about going back through history? I mean, I know they backtracked at Milan with the Dostoevsky course, but that kind of thing is quite interesting. Let's stop teaching Dostoevsky. How can you account for that kind of thing? Because there's no logic behind this, surely. Well,
there's not, and as you say, as you've already mentioned on the show, it has that absurd irony, given the fact that Dostoevsky spent time in a prison camp for reading banned books that were critical of the Tsarist regime.
Yeah.
But I think examples like that just show you that we're in quite a hysterical climate, and people are making decisions on the hoof, not recognising that they can have quite discriminatory and kind of censorious consequences, and even not just checking their facts. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about the Russian state ballets, which have been clamped down upon. Those are linked to the Russian state. It's not to say that they should be banned, but nevertheless. But the Russian state opera has also had a load of events cancelled in the UK. The Russian state opera is actually a branding name. It's a UK-based company. It has no links to the Russian government. It's not funded by any Russian organisation.
You can see why people would think it had.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
In that case, you can definitely see it. But I suppose the point I'm making is people are kind of just going to ban first, ask questions later, and I think that's a very bad position to be in.
Is there a case, though, for any kind of boycotts? I mean, I know a lot of people have boycotted, for instance, when it comes to Israel and the politics over there, people have boycotted products from Israel and that kind of thing. Is there a case for doing that if you feel that way about a particular regime or a particular scenario?
Well, I think the difficulty is with all of these boycotts, and particularly in the case of Israel, is that you're essentially conflating artists and individual citizens, whether it's of Russia or Israel or anywhere else, with the actions of their government, which is a really unpleasant kind of slippage that takes place. And even when people try and make kind of neater arguments for it, they say, well, if they receive state funding. I mean, if you think about all the arts institutions, all of the independent filmmakers who receive money from the UK government, that's a very slippery slope. So I also think the other thing is there's a tendency to be very almost like self-congratulating. People think that this is really what's going to make the difference. And if you think, one of the examples at the moment is Disney have pulled their upcoming Pixar release, which is called Turning Red, which is a film about a young girl who, when she gets too stressed, turns into a giant red panda.
Yes.
The idea that prohibiting Russian 8-year-olds from watching this is going to shift the dial in Vladimir Putin's mind is absurd, as well as kind of slightly cruel.
So you think it's just an opportunity for corporations and people like Disney to make a statement or be seen to be making a statement?
I think it is virtue signalling, but it's virtue signalling that comes at a cost, because I think if you treat all Russian audiences or all Russian artists, regardless of their perspective on the current conflict, as essentially morally tainted by dint of the actions of Vladimir Putin, it comes with a very real consequence, which is to say to kind of, again, burnish the narrative of the Russian government itself, which is to suggest that they do just hate you. They hate Russia, and that's why they're doing all these things.
But then where would you stand on, for instance, the freezing of the assets of oligarchs based in London or that kind of thing? Would that make more sense to you?
Well, it's an entirely different question, because that's about, are there particular individuals who are benefiting from the current regime financially, who are propping it up? That's a kind of a question around politics, around the economic response. But I just don't think any of these questions are transferable neatly to the cultural sphere. And actually, again, they can come at a consequence, because I think the more that you can encourage that level of kind of cross-border discussion, artistic exchange, the more the better. And a lot of the people we're talking about here are quite liberal-minded people. They might not be able to say that because of the clampdown that's going on in Russia at the moment and over the course of the past decade or so. But you're alienating those people as well. You're giving them less ability to speak out, and that surely can't be a good thing either. What
do you make, then, of the EU's decision to ban, for instance, Russia Today? I believe there was a moment where it was temporarily banned here in the UK. Maybe you can explain what happened there.
Yeah, so Russia Today, it was across the EU, there was this move to ban it. And in the UK, we've had Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, who's kind of become the Censorship Secretary in some respects in recent months, going after everyone from Jimmy Carter. Russia Today has written to Ofcom, basically calling for it to take action. It's actually fallen, I believe, off of Sky, off of people's Sky boxes, because of the fact it was hosted in Luxembourg, so it's been affected by the EU measures. But there's this general approach to it. Now, is Russia Today a different proposition from a ballet company? Certainly. I mean, they're spouting the Putin line, spreading all of this misinformation about Ukraine and this just being a peacekeeping mission, all the rest of it. But at the same time, it sets a really alarming precedent. We've seen retaliatory measures against the BBC, despite the fact that the BBC is growing in popularity in Russia. And also, it just seems to get the problem completely the wrong way around. I mean, Russia Today has quite a small audience in the UK, something like 3,000 people a day watch it. So this is not going to help. But again, the consequences of it are to legitimise censorship and to actually legitimise censorship in Russia as well, which is something we don't want to see.
But, I mean, something that occurs to me when all of this stuff is once we start into these debates about whether this ballet company should be there or this film should be shown and all this kind of... It is a major distraction from the issues that we should actually be discussing, isn't it? Or is it just a way for people to sort of get involved but not really get involved, you know?
I think there is a big part of that. I also think, and you all have noticed this and you've written a lot about it, which is the way in which kind of everything has become politicised now. I mean, there's a tendency towards that in times of war and conflict and all the rest of it. But you do feel like, whether it's on domestic issues, whether it's on these cultural war issues we're talking about, or genuine conflicts, there is this expectation that you must do something and you must say something, even if what you're expected to say is not that helpful, and what you're being asked to do or being expected to do could actually do more harm than good. But this kind of politicisation of everything, I think, has very negative consequences, especially for freedom of speech and for the arts, because there is just this tendency to, as I say, kind of ban first and ask questions later.